Hello? I'll do my best. Right, I'm here to talk to you about the question, can mental health nurses learn anything from chaplains? Can you all hear me okay? That's good, that was without. Is it possible to learn from chaplains when they exist in a completely different professional context to nurses? I've just had a very fascinating discussion with Grant, who is both a chaplain and a mental health nurse. So he can actually answer that question a lot better than I can, in the practical sense. But that's the question for today. And so what I'm going to talk today about is the Cholla Torres Bridge. Anybody heard of that? Thank goodness. How to do a PhD in 2 minutes. Why ethics matters most. And then go on to show you how chaplains help people. And the reason that's important is because we can compare that with how others help people. And then we need to pick the right bits from out of all of that so I can do some radical speculation. So the last couple of minutes is me just speculating. But there is some evidence in here as well. So the Cholla Torres Bridge is a suspension bridge located in, would you believe, Cholla Torres. Originally constructed in 1930, the bridge was constantly being blown down. So the Honduras government paid some Japanese constructors to build them a state-of-the-art, indestructible bridge. Okay? There it is. And sure enough, in 1998, Honduras was hit by a Category 5 storm, Mitch. I don't know if anyone remembers Mitch. It was a long time ago. Most of you weren't born, obviously. Honduras was wrecked. Roads were wiped out, considerable damage to buildings, and every other bridge in Honduras was destroyed. Every other bridge. There's the devastation. Terrible. Did the bridge survive? Who thinks the bridge survived? Most of you. Okay. Well, you're right. It did. Okay. The graceful arches of the new Cholla Torres Bridge stand abandoned, a white concrete sculpture far from shore, linking nowhere to nothing. The Cholla Torres Bridge itself is perfect, except of course that it now straddles dry land. Mitch changed the course of the Cholla Torres River. What can we learn from all that, do you think? If nothing stands still, then where do we start? How do we know what to do? Some of you are doing doctorates. Some of you may think about them. This is a knowledge question. How can we know? So this is how to do a PhD in 2 minutes, okay, for anyone who's thinking of it. Ontology is the way the world is. So we have to declare how the world is. Epistemology is knowledge of that world. Ethics is the art of doing the right thing. Method is the art of creating the right method to answer the question. And then, of course, you get your results. So that's how to do a PhD. You have to put a line through all of those, so your ontology and epistemology match up with your ethics and methods so that your results are coherent. Everyone make sense of that? Does that make sense? Slight sense? So, in the Cholla Torres Bridge, the ontology is that the world is real. Knowledge would be weather, because we experience that and that's real. Life is precious, so we should probably make stronger bridges, but the results don't always match our expectations because we don't consider everything. We can't consider everything. It's hard. That's called realism. Here's another one, see if you recognize this. Who said that? I know you're all thinking René Descartes, of course, and you'd be right. I think, therefore I am. That's the ontology. So there is experience, that's the epistemology. Life is precious. He asked the question because he thought life was precious. The method for understanding this sort of stuff is philosophy, and of course the results are Cartesian dualism. Everyone's heard of that. Most of our knowledge now is based on Cartesian dualism because Descartes asked that question in, I think, the 15th, 16th century. So that's idealism. Okay, so that's how to do a PhD. You declare how the world is, and then try and make your knowledge of that world and your method in understanding it consistent with that declaration of how the world is. But actually, there's nothing, which basically means you can make up anything you like and then create a methodology. So, the only consistent thing there is the ethics, isn't it? Life is precious. That was consistent throughout. I would suggest that in nursing, the only truth is that we need to prioritize doing the right thing, which is an ethical question, isn't it? So I've always been interested in the ethics of caring, of nursing. And so I think rather than how do we know what to do, we start with a better question. What's the right thing to do? That necessarily leads on to the question, who's the most ethical person I know? And the answer to that is the Reverend Ian Telfer. What a chap he is. That was before I met Grant, of course. Okay, so that is a really tenuous journey to why I started studying chaplains. Okay, they are the most ethical group of people, so I wanted to find out how they worked, what they did, and then if we could learn anything from them. So, here's a short history of chaplaincy in Scotland since 2010. Chaplains used to be employed by the church up until around the year 2000 when they became NHS employees across the UK. It came to Scotland a little bit later, and since 2010 we've had a different strategic direction for chaplaincy where they're completely employed by the NHS. They don't have any church affiliation whatsoever. Anybody can be a chaplain, even Grant. Too far? No. Okay, so the journey of in chaplaincy, the way I studied the chaplaincy was to make a patient-reported outcome measure. A patient-reported outcome measure comes from surgery, and basically it tries to measure the outcome of a particular intervention. So they started in hip surgery so that you could find out how well the hip had healed and so on. But now they used across health, across a range of different conditions, from mental health, anxiety, depression and so on. I was asked to make one for the Scottish Government in relation to chaplain interventions. So that's how I became involved not just with chaplains but with research in chaplains. So we made a prom in 2012, and I'll show you what that is in a second. A bit later on we tested the prom, and then the prom goes viral. That's my wife thinking that's me being trendy. Essentially it's really taken off. It's the only measurement of chaplain interventions that we have, and it's now being used all over the world. So I'm thinking that chaplains, towards the end of 2018, one day they'll become more important than politicians. And then, post-narcissism, the last selfie will ever be taken. I'm drifting off here, so please excuse me a second. It would be nice if the world was a bit nicer to each other, wasn't it? But anyway, back to what I'm talking about. So I can't lower that. This is the prom that I'm talking about. So these elements, we went to find out what chaplains did. So we looked at the literature. We had focus groups with chaplains and people who'd seen chaplains. And this is what we came up with. When a patient's with a chaplain, they feel that they're listened to. They're able to talk about what's on their mind. Their faith and beliefs are valued, and they feel understood. Now, that took a couple of years to get to that point, and the reason we were so thorough was because we wanted a good, solid theoretical grounding to our prom. So these elements are in the prom. So during my meeting with the listener or chaplain, I was listened to, able to talk about what was on my mind, my situation was understood, faith beliefs were valued. Okay, so you can see where those items came from in the questionnaire. Likewise, after you'd seen a chaplain, people talked about feeling that they could be more honest with themselves. They were less anxious, they had a more positive outlook on life, they felt more in control and more at peace. And those elements went into the outcome measure. So what we do with this measure is we give this to people both before and after they've seen the chaplain, and we can measure the difference, and we can also look at the relationships between these items and these items. So for example, if someone's listened to by the chaplain all of the time, then we would hopefully think that people might become less anxious. Does that make sense? And also we can use this as a standalone measure. So we can take, basically this scores from 0 to 10, and you can see how people are before, and then measure that with how people are after chaplaincy. I think it's taken off because people find it really easy to complete. So it only takes about 2 minutes for anybody to complete. And we can also look at the relationship between religion, whether people describe themselves as spiritual and so on, and these outcomes as well. It also generates a lot of interesting free text data where, really interesting, people write about how they feel. They often do in this box. And we ask chaplains to write about the encounters as well. And what's really fascinating about that is that chaplains often use exactly the same language as people in describing how they are and how they felt. And I just think that's fascinating. I challenge nurses to do the same. So here's an experiment we did using the prom to find out how chaplains help people. So if you just keep that in mind, this is what we call the prom looks like. So we thought that there'll be a significant correlation between all the items during my meeting with the chaplain and the total prom scores, the outcome measure on the right. And hypothesis 2 was that being able to talk about what was on my mind will show the strongest correlation. Now the reason we came up with that hypothesis was because it seemed to arise in a lot of the pilot data that we got. So every time we looked at this, that seemed to be the most important element of chaplaincy for people. Okay? So before we went and thought about that anymore, we had to do this test. And if true, this would mean that being able to talk about what's on your mind during a chaplain encounter is the most important element of that encounter. So we did a study. We started there with our research question. And our research question is that people who feel they can really talk about what's on their mind with a chaplain will get a greater benefit than those that do not. Okay, then we constructed a protocol, went through ethics, got permissions to do the study. Okay, we can now go ahead and do it. This is how to do a study for anybody who hasn't done one, reducing a couple of years' work down into one slide. So then we go and gather our data. We had 2,600 people in the study. 103 returned from the UK, 499 from Australia. Then we analysed the data in line with hypotheses and published. So what we found was, this was the group of people who responded to our study. Okay, as you can see, mainly older adults, I suppose. But there are some younger folk here. Most of them describe themselves as neither religious or spiritual, but actually exactly the same amount describe themselves as both religious and spiritual, and then these were the unique categories as well. So spiritual people here, 14%, 14% were religious. So actually, taking that all together, the majority of people describe themselves as either spiritual, religious, or both, with about a third saying they were neither one thing nor the other. That's the prom scores. I'm showing you that because it's almost a beautiful. There's probably only me who enjoys a graph like that. Anyone else having a good time with that graph? Okay, no, it's just me, isn't it? Okay, that's a normal distribution, or more or less a normal distribution, which gets people doing psychometrics like me really excited. That means that it's probably picking up a nice, long, wide range of people. So this is the centre, the middle. This means that most people score around here, between 11 and 12, say. So that's the norm on this scale. Whereas if you go standard deviation either way, you've got these incredibly, ludicrously happy people over here, and some not so spiritually happy people over here. And this is important because once we get enough data in, we'll be able to calibrate the prom and say, if you score less than whatever, 8 or 9 or 7 or something like that here, then you probably need a specialist. These people probably require specialist referral. That's the important element from that. But that's a bit of a digression. What we were looking for, remember, was being able to talk about what was on my mind. Was that the strongest correlation? Well, you can see from the graph that yes, it was. So I was able to talk about what was on my mind was the strongest correlation with the prom scores. Stronger than being listened to, understood, or having my faith or beliefs valued. So, why? I suppose we've just been talking about this with Grant as well, and we talked about this, it being agenda free. A chaplain doesn't have an agenda apart from the person that is in front of him or her. I just think that's incredibly powerful. I think people describe themselves as feeling in control as well, which is also incredibly important. Do we support those people that we see in nursing to be in control? Hopefully, maybe not as much. People described, releasing pressure. So they let off steam, they just talking. I think this is probably familiar to us mental health nurses. So you're not keeping it all in, you're sharing it with somebody as well. And of course there's the self-management element of it. But I suppose it's the agenda-free element that interests me most, and I'll come back to that. And if you're interested, we've published the paper. So, what we do is we all start asking people what's on your mind. Is that what we conclude from that? Anyone ever seen that before, what's on your mind? Does it look familiar? Probably just to older people. It's on Facebook. As soon as you open up Facebook, it says what's on your mind, doesn't it? I don't know if you realise that, but it does. So I was thinking, that looks familiar. So, of course, none of you youngsters will know what that is. Facebook, it's an app that old people use to talk to each other. So, it raises an interesting question, doesn't it? If we want to be starting asking people what's on your mind. Well, what would happen if different professions were to ask the same question? So would you get the same response? So excuse me just diverting for a second into some other work I do. I work with people in cancer consultations using the holistic needs assessment. Okay, so the reason I'm mentioning this is because it answers the question I've just raised. So holistic needs assessment, so many cancer survivors have moderate to severe unmet needs, so we need to be able to assess what these needs are so that we can help them. And holistic needs assessment helps ascertain someone's holistic needs by using a structured self-report tool. Okay, so what that means is, this is the holistic needs assessment. It's made up of physical, emotional, practical, lifestyle, family, and spiritual elements broken down into individual items. So your physical concerns, for example, include breathing difficulties, passing urine, constipation, diarrhea, eating, and so on. Emotional concerns, difficulty making plans. Practical concerns, caring responsibilities, work and education. Lifestyle or information needs are about support groups, diet, nutrition, smoking. Family, about partner, children, other relatives, friends. and spiritual needs, which is about loss of faith, loss of meaning and purpose of life. Okay, so how it works in practice is someone is asked if they would like a holistic needs assessment. Someone's diagnosed with cancer. They're sent an appointment from Improving Cancer Journeys, which is the body that I'm working with. And what happens is someone opens up the concerns checklist. So the person, we often go round to the patient's house, but this can be completed in library, pharmacy, lots of other places. But most people choose to have it done in their own home. So this person goes round to the individual's house, takes out this holistic needs assessment, and then goes through it all with the person. And as a result of identifying their needs, which may be physical, emotional, practical, and so on, they then create a care plan. Okay, does that make sense? I suppose what's interesting in relation to the question we're looking at here is that I've got data from nurses, from council employees, from oncologists and psychologists, all asking the same sets of questions to people. Okay? So that holistic needs assessment has been used by lots of different professions. So going back to the chaplain question, you know, if we were all to garner the same results, you would expect the answers to be the same, because they're all asked the same questions. Would you expect the answers to be the same? So you've got different professions asking the same questions. And the answer, of course, is no, they don't get the same responses at all. I've only got two here, but this is quite an interesting graph. This is the top needs in relation to what people describe. So these are nurses on this side, and these are council workers on this side. So as you can see, the most important need that people identify when they're talking to nurses is being tired or having worry. Okay? However, in ICJ, it's money or housing. So using exactly the same assessment, council workers elicit money and housing. It's only the 15th most important element when nurses do that. Okay? And in other professionals, you can see the take-home message from this is that these are all different. Okay? You can see that. So when the psychologists complete the holistic needs assessment, they elicit mainly emotional needs. Okay? And a bit of physical here, tiny bit of spiritual. Quite a nice spread though, not too bad. With oncologists, as you can imagine, it's nearly all physical. No spiritual needs at all. A few practical, maybe a bit of family needs, and a tiny, weeny bit of emotional needs. Okay? Council workers, as we've just seen, that's their breakdown. Nurses, I'd say nurses are doing quite well here because they've got a nice bit of everything there. But I suppose the take-home from this is that they're all different, aren't they? So what happens if we were all to start asking people what's on your mind? Depending on who you are, the person would respond differently. So, can mental health nurses learn anything from chaplains? What have we learned? Nothing is certain. And people respond differently to different professionals asking the same questions. Okay, so all doom and gloom then. We haven't learned anything today, have we, so far? Nothing to learn, nothing to see here. Except that's not the whole story, is it? Look at that. That's the bridge today. Things change. Things change back. Things move forward. Stuff changes. No, stuff happens. So I thought I'd draw my graph of nonsense here to explain everything. So this is Austyn Snowden's explanation of what's going on. Okay, so this is all completely true, obviously. But what we've got here is narcissism and greed since the post-war era, where everything was lovely, where we had altruistic, socially connected society. This has now plummeted to an all-time low, where everybody's on their phones all the time. Nobody notices the person next to them. I call that peak Trump. But what about post-Trump? Like, everything has a reaction, doesn't it? You know, there are so many elements going on at the moment. But I think this was like peak we. How about that? Back at the war and the war, but that went down. Whereas what we've got at the moment is peak me. But I don't think that'll last. I'm not that depressed about it. Unless you watch... no, anyway, won't go there. I'm sure we'll be fine. This is me being optimistic. So me will disappear and we'll go up to peak we again. That's coming. Where we all connect with each other and at least start to notice each other. So what else can we learn from this? I think, all right, we might not come out with the same answers, but that shouldn't stop us listening to people, asking them about what's on their mind, valuing people's beliefs, and trying to understand them. The fact that we elicit different responses is irrelevant as far as I'm concerned, if you focus in on doing the right thing. So I'd like to think that when a patient is with a mental health nurse, they also feel those things as well. And just because you get a different response is just a justification for having different professions. It's not a reason for not asking the questions. So, can mental health nurses learn anything from chaplains? Yes, fair enough, nothing certain, but maybe we could just listen a bit better. How's that? The end.
Great, thanks Austyn. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. Whoa. If anyone has... No?
No, not so whoa.
Whoa, okay. 15 minutes for questions if anyone's got a question.
Got some more pictures if you'd like.
Anything?
I stunned everybody.
Stunned them into silence. Question down here. Do we need a microphone or...? No.
I just want to know, it's along with our podcast.
Yes.
I mean, do we first of all have to really understand that nothing's certain and people respond differently to different professionals asking the same question? That's simple common sense, isn't it?
Yes, I'm a researcher. You've just destroyed my way of being. What? Sorry. Oh God, it isn't, is it? Yes, maybe.
I think there's a bit of tongue in cheek here.
Oh, there is. I appreciate that, and I think that's fine. I think you're right. If everybody thought like you, we'd be fine, but they don't. And so I think we need evidence to move some of these complicated debates forward. People do find... I did hear that people thought, using the holistic needs assessment would gather the same information, and that's just simply not true. So that was an important finding. Chaplains' jobs are under threat, so we need to make sure that we understand what they do in order to support them and say, for example, they work in primary care and do a fantastic job helping people with subclinical mental health problems to survive in the community. So, struggling with bereavement, they get listened to there, and I think that's also really, really important. And so you can measure the impact. And so, the rest of it was glib. It was me trying to link a load of research that I've done, put it together and try and have a go at Trump, because I don't think the world's as bad as it looks. That's all. And you've sussed me.
I suppose my response to that is that it seems so obvious, but exactly as you said, not everyone thinks that way, and how I suppose it just shows how actually radical it is and how it's a very political thing, and you bring Trump in is relevant to listen to people and also to create the time and space, because that requires resources. That doesn't just happen, to be able to create that time and space. So
Exactly.
it's an obvious thing is people like to be listened to, but actually also need to do that. So
I think
so I think actually it is kind of more a stronger statement than it sounds.
I think there's another way around to doing your research.
well, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I'm not a researcher, that's the other thing.
I disagree.
I suppose everyone's a researcher in their own respect. And as they've lived life, then they've got views, and if you've got views, you're a researcher. So I suppose you're getting through a number of things here. So you're not just doing the chaplaincy bit here, you're doing a lot of psychology here.
Yes, yeah, I suppose I started off because I was just interested in everything. Yeah, you're actually raising some really quite profound issues in me, because, you know, why am I doing this stuff? Because I think it's important, and I think it's important to show people as they actually are, and to garner evidence, I guess, for the people who are not very good at shouting about it themselves. Chaplains are not organised. If they're not, they don't need protecting exactly, but I think they need valuing more, and I think listening needs valuing more. But I'm a researcher, not a politician, and I know what you mean. I've got to do what I'm good at, not what you're good at.
We need researchers and we need politicians, but we need the people in between. And the people in between, you say they don't have a voice, but they do. They do have a voice.
Okay.
And when they're better, they can tell you that one. And when they're better, that's evidence. That's the evidence that the chaplain has done his work.
I hear you.
Just to say, well, Austin, Unite has the Healthcare Chaplains Association as part of our umbrella organisation, and last week it was Healthcare Chaplains Week, so some nice parallels and join-ups there. Well, Mike has...
Excellent.
Bit of an academic question, maybe. Measurement and judgment came out at me from that. You said it was glib, but there were some areas of measurement using the holistic needs assessment. It doesn't really measure what it claims it measures if it gets such divergent responses, you could argue. Measurement and judgment sometimes collide and sometimes overlap and sometimes are hand in glove with one another. There's judgments can come out of this work as well. You can debunk prejudgment, if you like, to some extent. And for chaplains that's important because it sounds like judgments have been made about them without looking at the measurements or looking at the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
I think judgments are we all make judgments about everybody all the time. The problem with chaplaincy is it's a really young profession. And so it's a very old profession, it's an ancient profession, but it's very young in NHS terms, and so therefore, it's not necessarily protected. It's not a profession, actually. Within the NHS, it's not even a profession. So we'll let Grant speak to that as to what that means. But in relation to the measurement element, we have, I can't show you all my research in one go. You need to, in order to, calibrate these things, is check them out against something else. So obviously we've done a lot of convergent and divergent validity studies, and we just haven't done quite enough yet. But those scores do seem to represent something against the Warwick and Edinburgh, and even elements of the EQ5D. So it's quite interesting. It does seem to be picking up the right things. Which isn't surprising because we made it in Scotland, so most of the work's been done in Scotland. People are scoring differently in different countries, so there's a lot of studies going on using that measure in Belgium and Holland and the States and Australia, and they are getting different cohorts with different norms, which is also interesting. So I disagree with you that it's not measuring anything, but...
I do think it's measured. It was the holistic needs assessment. I'm not sure if it's measured.
Oh, right, you were talking about the holistic needs assessment.
I'm talking about
Oh, right. No, that's another thing altogether. Macmillan just took that from the distress thermometer. So they took the words distress thermometer off it and turned it into something else. And so, yeah, that's a very valid question. What is it actually measuring? But where I would say that it is measuring something is that these are the people with genuine distress. And so, actually finding out what someone needs and then addressing it and then going back and finding out that need is no longer there is surely, a good. So it is a good thing. So, but I do find it fascinating that different people can ask it and you get completely different results based on your assumption of the person in front of you. So I do think that's an important element. And I get it that that's also, common sense, but not necessarily to everybody.
Thanks for all the name dropping, Austin. That was really good. Just to put a context to my story then, for a number of years I lived in a small village, but I exited that village. If I drove south, I was driving at one health board, there was a senior charge nurse in Children's Mental Health Service. And if I drove north, I drove into another health board where there was a senior chaplain in lead for spiritual care in mental health services. So that is my background. We briefly talked about lunch, what's the difference and what was the difference, and I said to you without ever having seen your slides was the sense that when I was operating in the sphere of chaplaincy I felt as if the person was my only agenda. It was nice to see that word replicated on your slide. As a nurse I had multiple agendas and multiple masters.
That's right.
I was listening for assessment predominantly as a nurse, making judgments on information and interpretation, and as a chaplain there would be the freedom from that where I could let the person tell their story and just help them guide. Colin Murray Parks, the loss writer, says that when people are telling you their story, sometimes they're telling it to themselves, and it's about facilitating hearing your own story. I think both roles enhance the other role for me. I became a better listener as a nurse from being a chaplain. The only problem you get, one final comment in that dual role, is the nurses saw the chaplain in me and the chaplain saw the nurse in me, and neither were as accepting quite as much. And the final comment about chaplains are not healthcare professionals. In the NHS and NHS Scotland, they are healthcare support workers and meet the regulations of healthcare support workers.
Oh, thank you. I suppose I was looking for a professional registration like nurse, the NMC, and they need to sort that out.
Body, but it's not universally.
No, it's voluntary. Imagine if nursing was voluntary. Ooh, nobody would pay. Well, I wouldn't, would you? Anyway, that's a separate issue. Thanks for that, Grant. Can I just ask you one more question?
Of course.
Could you prevent the nurse in you doing a risk assessment?
I think all human beings are making judgments about whether something is safe and whether they feel safe, whether people around them feel safe. So I think whilst as a nurse you are educated to look for particular risks for the person, for yourself and your body and the employer. Because I was predominantly working in mental health services and spiritual care, risk was a natural part of that conversation. But I tried to tame the risk voice in my mind a little.
Do you think it would have been less if you'd not known about the nursing risk? That's an impossible question.
I think I would have still considered risk as a human being. I wouldn't necessarily have the skills to make judgments and weights about risk that nursing is already doing.